or enjoying art is a fun pastime for many. But what if I told you art is also good for your brain? I'm with Professor Bastiaan Bloem, a neurologist and director of the Center of Expertise for Parkinson's and Movement Disorders at RadboudUMC Medical Center in the Netherlands. Bas specializes in non-pharmacological or non-medication approaches to Parkinson's. He's also the recipient of the Michael J. Fox Foundation's 2025 Robert A. Prtizker Prize for Leadership in Parkinson's Research. Since we're talking about art, here's a fun fact. The physical award Bas received was designed by an artist living with Parkinson's, Tom Shannon. Bas plans to use the Prtizker Prize funds for a research trial on the effects of art for people with Parkinson's. It's really such a treat to have you here, Bas.
I'm so grateful to be here.
We, of course, both share an interest in lifestyle for Parkinson's, which is exercise, diet, stress management, but art is something we don't talk about as much. So what do we mean when we talk about art for Parkinson's?
I think it is two main components. It is either creating art, for example, painting or making music, sculpturing, photography, or it's enjoying art. The one is called, in technical terms, creative arts. The other one is called receptive arts. And I think they are both have healing powers.
Can they both be just as good, doing art and enjoying art?
I am convinced, based on what I'm hearing in my practice, that art is better than no art. But formally, you have to study this. So what we're proposing is to use the Prtizker Award money to fund a properly designed, rigorous trial to show that its three branches, no art, receptive art, creative arts, leads to better health, better quality of life.
When we talk about art, I think I'm guilty of this too, at thinking about it as paintings I might look at in the museum or paintings somebody else might be creating on their own. But what are the different types of art-based intervention for Parkinson's?
Yeah, so we've done a pilot study where some people opted for painting, others opted for writing, others opted for music, sculpturing, photography. So art has a whole range of interventions, and it doesn't really matter what you do, as long as you do it, and that it's tailored to your wishes and abilities.
Mm-hmm. And since we're talking about art and creativity, right, you can get creative with the art you do, I think, right? You could arrange flowers, you could do woodworking, you could experiment with recipes even. So it's about bringing in that art to your life in whatever way works for you. How are the arts that we're discussing different from structured art therapy?
Yeah, so that's a question I often get, and art therapists are professionals supervising and coaching people in creating art. And if you truly regard art as a therapy, then maybe you need an art therapist to supervise the process. At the same time, I want to get people outside of the healthcare system and show that they're human beings. So in our study, it were artists who were coaching and supervising the participants in our trial rather than art therapists. I think you can either have an art therapist or an artist supervising the folks that want to engage in art.
And how does art compare to other lifestyle interventions like exercise or diet that we know are so important for living well with Parkinson's?
Parkinson's is, I think, one of the most complex diseases in the world. Pathophysiology is complex. The way people manifest their symptoms is different, their wishes and needs are different, and that complexity requires a holistic approach, really tackling disease from every possible angle. And I've often likened people with Parkinson's to athletes, professional athletes, and I like that metaphor. An athlete can only perform at the Olympics if everything is perfect. Their nutrition, their stress levels, their training. Now, if you have Parkinson's, you need to turn every knob. And in that regard, exercise is important, nutrition is important, stress management is important, but as part of that holistic approach, I think art is still a missing piece. We need to prove that it really works. The anecdotes suggest it does, and we're now taking it to the test.
We have a question from one of our community members, Barbara Salzberg Matthews. Barbara's an artist and educator living in Ontario, Canada, and she was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2020. In her youth, she was a professional mime artist, and she now uses that training to help override her Parkinson's symptoms. So her question is, has research using arts-based interventions measured improvements of executive function for those living with Parkinson's?
So executive function, just to explain what it means, it is the ability of our brain, it's the front part of the brain called the frontal lobe, where we organize and plan movements. For example, if you go shopping, you say, oh, I first need to get my groceries, and then I get, this part and then the meat. And to organize and to plan it requires executive function. And people with Parkinson's often have difficulty getting that oversight and getting things organized and getting things done. And in a way, creating a painting requires planning and organization. So we also see that sometimes people have, because of the executive dysfunction, have difficulty creating art. I'm a strong believer in the use it or lose it concept. So by deploying art, by becoming active in the arts, you might protect those systems from degenerating further.
What about art for other symptoms of Parkinson's? So for tremor or slowness or stiffness or even mood symptoms, all the gamut of symptoms that can happen with Parkinson's.
So all of my interest in art started in my consultation room. Individuals who brought me art and said it gave them consolation, relief, it showed that there were persons. We've then taken it to the test in a pilot study. And in that pilot study, the main effects were actually not on walking or postural stability. It was on tremor. It was on anxiety. And what people told me is they reached a state of flow. So flow is that magical balance between what you can do and being challenged. You don't want to be over-challenged. You don't want to be under-challenged. People came in with dyskinesias, the involuntary movements, because of the adverse effects of medication. It disappeared. The tremor disappeared. And for hours while producing art, people forgot about Parkinson's. And what I find magical in that study, it extended well beyond the art session. So it may have prolonged effects. And I think it has a lot of effects on the non-motor symptoms, for particularly stress and anxiety.
I was just going to say the stress management piece is really interesting because this is what we talk about with lifestyle in general too, is how do I combine these tools to treat more than one thing? But here art is that could potentially help with mood, help with stress, get you in that flow state. The thing we're all chasing is slowing progression of Parkinson's. Is there any chance that art could slow progression of Parkinson's?
Two of my more provocative papers showed that people with Parkinson's, if you go back and you look at the choice of job at age 20, way before Parkinson's, men that opted to become an artist had a lower risk of developing Parkinson's. It wasn't full protection, but there was a lower risk. So one possibility, which is kind of provocative and exciting, is that maybe engaging in art throughout your life conveys protective abilities on the brain. Another explanation, which I think is equally likely, is that those folks that are born with a lot of dopamine are more likely to be creative, because dopamine is the chemical we need to be creative. And that same high level of dopamine protects you from ever dropping below the critical threshold to develop Parkinson's. So I don't know whether it is really neuroprotective. I do strongly feel that the use it or lose it concept is important for people with Parkinson's. And for that reason alone, I would highly recommend, if you enjoy it, go and do art.
And we talked about art being potentially a stress reliever. And we know that stress is not good for symptoms of Parkinson's. You've also done some research to show maybe it could contribute to the progression of Parkinson's.
Absolutely.
So all the more reason to control that stress or manage that stress, and maybe art could be a way to do that.
Yep.
We have another community question, this time from Hadley Ferguson, who is a patient activist and artist based in Missoula, Montana. She's a member of the Foundation's Patient Council, and she lives with multiple system atrophy, which is a disease similar to Parkinson's. So her question is there a change in the brain that brings on this sense of creativity in people with Parkinson's? Does it have something to do with the loss of dopamine? Some people suddenly start writing, or they like dance programs, or they pick up instruments. So it doesn't seem to be limited to one type of artwork, it's just creativity in general.
How that works in the brain is a vexing one, and I'll be honest about this. Dopamine is the chemical that's lacking in the brain of people with Parkinson's. The same dopamine is what you need to be creative. What we know is that there are quite a number of people with Parkinson's who start on dopaminergic medication and become artists for the first time in their life. So that dopamine was triggering creativity. Now there's two possibilities. One is, and I think this is the most likely explanation, those people would have been artists all their life anyway, but since they were already having a low dopamine level, even in the prodromal, the lead-up phase to Parkinson's, they were never an artist, and now the therapy is restoring what they had been missing all their life. The other possibility, which I cannot exclude, is that the way we treat people with Parkinson's is a non-physiological way of stimulating the dopaminergic system. And maybe you turn a funny knob in the brain, and that elicits art.
So medications can impact creativity
Definitely.
in some people, maybe not everybody. Does creativity ever decrease after diagnosis?
Yeah, we studied this and we published a paper recently in Nature Parkinson's Disease. We did a big survey. What we see is that because of the loss of dexterity, but also the declining levels of dopamine, people who had been artists give up being an artist. So we see loss of creativity. We also see increases in creativity under the influence of dopaminergic medication. And I think about 40% experienced a change in their artistic expressions after the diagnosis. Theoretically, art could have adverse effects. We see that dopaminergic therapy can bring out creativity, but we see that particularly with dopamine agonists. And that is nice, but sometimes there's a risk. Creativity and addictive behavior are on the same spectrum. And sometimes we see that people get addicted to art, painting all day, all night long, particularly with dopamine agonists. So that's when you maybe need an art therapist to supervise.
And that gets into our next comment somewhat about adapting to life with changes in creativity or in expression. So Diana Rodriguez is a business coach living in Toronto, Canada. She was diagnosed with Parkinson's in her 30s and joined the Foundation's Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative study soon after. Diana has always found joy in the arts, whether it's painting, designing theater, or special effects makeup. She shares, lately with Parkinson's and my hands shaking, it is my mission to enjoy art and do as much as I can. Of course, there's the research that shows that it helps, but for me, it's just not letting it win and challenging it back and doing something that I really enjoy and love for as long as I can.
Wow. I mean, what can I add to that? I mean, it's a living testimony of the powers of art. And yes, you know, we should never let Parkinson's win. And in addition to medication, exercise, I think art is becoming a component of that holistic approach that people with Parkinson's deserve.
When somebody is an artist and wants to express themselves in that way, but their Parkinson's is impacting their art, what can they do? How can they adapt around it?
Yeah, so I think optimizing medication is one. As you know, the fear of medication is still prevalent. And I think many people that I see in my clinical practice are still undertreated. But I think in general, people should not be too afraid of medication. And that can help with dexterity issues, etc. Working with art therapists or artists can help, or go to receptive arts and enjoy the benefits of observing other people's art. We know that, for example, enjoying music is a powerful way of helping people with Parkinson's. Can I just say, I've got this man in my clinic who can barely walk. When he puts on an opera, Orpheus and Eurydice by Gluck, he waltzes with his wheeled rollator. Gives me goosebumps as I'm speaking to you now.
And this note on medication is interesting. I always tell people medication is something to consider when Parkinson's gets in the way of what you want or need to do.
Yeah.
And want and need can be exercise and
Exactly.
art. And one question I had when thinking about this and who could most benefit is, could this be another tool for people with processing the diagnosis? Because of course that's such a challenging time for so many, and while counseling can be really helpful, maybe some people are hesitant. It's not a substitute for that, but maybe it could be another tool to offer for people.
I think those 3 words, you have Parkinson's, knock people off their feet. So I will give you one example. Urs Bracci. He was a man from Switzerland who had never been an artist. He got the diagnosis. Devastating. But then he decided to become an artist, and he paints pasta, like spaghetti, macaroni, but other types of pasta. And he said, and people will love this, you don't realize you have 2 lives. So the 3 words, you have Parkinson's, might mean the ending of your life as you knew it. But his second life started as an artist. And it was a way for him to keep expressing himself and to lead this new life.
It's so important to think about that, giving Parkinson's the space it needs. It's part of your life. You wouldn't want it, you wouldn't wish it, but now it's part of your life. And so how do you move forward with this as part of your life? And I think about it as well with, in general, Parkinson's are not just the processing. We all go through so much all day, every day. And so if art or writing or creating in some other way can help us process what we're feeling and reflecting, it's really such a powerful tool. So thinking practically, how do people add this to their lives? What do we need to think about as far as cost or side effects or finding a program or buying supplies?
So let's start with the costs. One of the reasons I'm so happy that because of the Prtizker Award, I can now put decent science behind my conviction that art helps, is I think ultimately the payers, the insurance companies, the states, the government should reimburse art. Just like we're reimbursing drugs. I think if we can demonstrate, replicate what we found in our pilot work, namely that it has robust effects on anxiety, on stress, and didn't tell you, in our pilot study, hospital visits went down. Consultations with physios went down. People visited the artist instead of the doctor. So art might well become a way of controlling healthcare costs. But I think, particularly for those folks who are less well off, I think it is fair that art is reimbursed. But that's why I need the science first.
And in the meantime, art doesn't have to be a very expensive endeavor.
No, exactly. It could be drawing. It could be listening to music. But try to work with somebody who is more experienced in the world of art so that you can work together in finding your sweet spot. And what we learned in our study is that even people, in fact, we purposely selected people who said, I'm not interested in arts. They sat down with these artists. Invariably, we found the individual sweet spot. And then people took it home, and now, they enjoy it, and it stays with them.
So one final community question from Rebecca Gifford, who is a writer, a workshop facilitator, and communications executive living in Vancouver, Canada. She's also a care partner to her husband, Larry, who lives with Parkinson's. Rebecca says, in my writing workshops, we practice writing without expectations, which basically means retraining ourselves to take the right and wrong out of the process. We approach our writing time with curiosity about where it will take us that day, and then we celebrate and congratulate ourselves for having written it all. So Rebecca asks, is there any research on the impact of art and creative expression specific to care partners and caregivers?
Wow, what a good question. We should stop talking about patients with Parkinson's. We should talk about persons with Parkinson's. And in fact, we should be talking about families with Parkinson's. Parkinson's is, I think, the penultimate disease that affects the whole family, the spouse, the children, and they too deserve our attention. And I think art might also be a wonderful way to give them hope and support and perspective.
One of the things we always talk about when we're talking to care partners is make sure to take care of yourself. And I say, they glaze over and say, that's a nice concept, but tell me how and when my plate already feels very full. But it strikes me that something like art writing for 5 minutes a day or enjoying a piece of art, even if you could bring in something as small as that for a few minutes a day, can really help and support you in your own self-care. Could this also be a place for loved ones and people with Parkinson's to connect and bond?
Yes. So what we've been seeing is that we brought people together. So in our pilot study, we called it a playground. And the playground was literally different pieces or types of art that you could engage with. But the people were together. So they created a community and learned from each other, inspired each other. So I think art is a wonderful way of reconnecting.
And communication for some people is impacted by Parkinson's, whether it's voice or executive function like we were talking about. And so I think it's such a nice way to connect and bond over something that doesn't require words.
Yeah.
As we wrap up, is there anything else that you want people and families with Parkinson's to know about art?
It is a time of hope. There is hope, and art is part of the new hope. There are new drugs on the horizon. We have attention to lifestyle. Parkinson's today, honestly, is already a different world than, say, 30 years ago when I started as a 21-year-old. So this is a time of real hope and optimism.
Well, this was really an enlightening and fun conversation. For everyone watching, I hope this has sparked some curiosity to pick up a paintbrush or try some new dance moves. I know I feel motivated to find new ways to bring art into my own day-to-day. Thanks to our community members for sharing your questions and experiences, and thank you, Bas, for all of your insights. You can learn more about brain health and lifestyle at michaeljfox.org/askthemd.